Good evening to our Director and Deputy Director of the Institute of Teacher Education Ilmu Khas campus, or known as IPGKIK, and a very good morning, especially to our distinguished guest, Professor Lani Florian from the United Kingdom. A very good evening too to the heads of departments, lecturers, and students from IPGKIK and teachers. I am Dr. Ilhavenil Narinasamy, and I will be moderating this live webinar session on inclusive pedagogy. What, why, and how. Today, we have two lovely presenters who are Professor Lani Florian from the University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom, and Dr. Liza Isyqi, our senior lecturer from the Department of Educational Studies, IPGKIK. Before we proceed, we would like to invite our beloved director, Dr. Faridah Yakob, to address the audience here with her opening speech. Please welcome Dr. Faridah.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And a very good evening to everyone, and a very good morning, especially to our distinguished speaker, Professor Lani Florian from the University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom. Welcome to the Ilmu Khas International Academic Discourse series, or known as IKIADS. And I believe that this is the 8th series of this year, 2022. I am Dr. Faridah Yakob, the Director of Institute of Teacher Education at Khas campus, Kuala Lumpur. First of all, I would like to thank each one of you for joining the academic discourse on inclusive pedagogy. I feel great proud to say that this is the first program that is organized by our Department of Educational Studies that sees the collaboration between the institution and the University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom. This collaboration will definitely enlighten great minds and promote the participation of educators at all levels. All this note, I bid a very warm welcome to our renowned speaker, Professor Lani Florian, who has taken her valuable time and joined us today to be a part of this wonderful discourse. We are honored to have her with us. I would also like to offer my appreciation to the program committee that made this program materialized. I would also like to convey my deep appreciation to the Deputy Director and several heads of departments of this institution for their tremendous support in organizing international events. The schedule of this discourse will focus on inclusive pedagogy, the what, the why, and the how. As we all know, pedagogy is a term that refers to the method of how teachers teach in theory and in practice. But what about inclusive pedagogy? So let us all pay attention to the details of this interesting topic. I wish this discourse enlighten us all and provide us with approaches to dealing with students from various backgrounds and learning styles. As the saying goes, our job is not to prepare students for something. Our job is to help students prepare themselves for anything out there. Thank you, everyone who has sacrificed his or her time to make this academic discourse a success. Please do enjoy the session, and if possible, do adapt and adopt what you have achieved here, inshallah. So take care. Enjoy. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Faridah Yakob. How true is the saying, as we as educators help students prepare themselves for anything. Before we begin, I have a few housekeeping notes. Today's session is being recorded to be available for viewing post-webinar. If you have any questions for the presenters, please use the chat feature in this webinar. Each presenter today will have a total of 15 minutes for their presentation, and We will hold most questions until the end of the session, and I will then read questions out loud for the presenters to answer as time permits. Now, let's please welcome our first presenter, Professor Lani Florian. Professor Lani Florian is the University of Edinburgh Bell Chair of Education and Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. She has published widely, and her work has been translated into several languages. She is the editor of the Sage Handbook of Special Education, now in its second edition, and co-author of Achievement and Inclusion in Schools, also in its second edition. She is best known for her work on the concept of inclusion pedagogy as a way of working that can improve educational outcomes for everyone, and teacher education for inclusive education. Her research challenges the assumption that certain groups of children, in particular those who find learning difficult, have a detrimental effect on the achievement of other children, and shows how high levels of inclusion can be entirely compatible with high levels of achievement. She argues that combining the two is not only possible, but also essential if all children are to have the opportunity to participate fully in education. Her research has supported initiatives in many countries funded by international agencies, including the British Council, Open Society Foundations, and the Council of Europe. Upon listening to all these, ladies and gentlemen, how lucky we are to have her here today. The floor is all yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. I very much appreciate the opportunity to address you today. I have had the opportunity to visit your beautiful country. I have not had a chance to work there, so it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm always delighted to talk about my work on inclusion to teachers, in part because I've learned so much from teachers over the years. And one of the things that we have learned as researchers is that inclusion in education is very complex. And today, what I want to do is to think together with you about the what, the why, and the how of inclusion. If we can move to the next slide, you will see that inclusive education is spoken about in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And we talk about ensuring a quality education and promoting lifelong learning for everyone. This is a global movement. It's about excuse me, ensuring that everyone has an opportunity to learn. Inclusive education is the way that we do that, making sure that no one is excluded or left behind. And so it's very important. And this is the why of inclusive education. But if we move to the next slide, we'll see that it's a complex and difficult concept for us as practitioners to understand, in part because there's a lot of variability in practice. And by that I mean that when we go into national context and we study the practices of people who are trying to implement the policy of inclusion and achieve the Sustainable Development Goal, we see positive and negative experiences happening within the same system. And that makes it very difficult to know what constitutes good practice. You know, how do we know inclusion is happening? How do we identify it in practice? And how do we develop that practice? Because we're saying we see positive and negative experiences in the same situation. So what I thought I would do is to try to unpack some of the language of inclusion to help us think about that. If we can go to the next slide, please. I think we have to differentiate the concepts or the terms inclusive education, inclusive practice, and inclusive pedagogy. And if we think about inclusive education, that's the big picture. And inclusive education has been defined as a process of increasing participation and reducing exclusion from the culture, the community, and curriculum of schooling. And that will mean different things in different places because the national context defines what counts as the culture, the curriculum, and community of schooling. But an example of this would be compulsory education laws. Again, they vary from country to country, but that's the idea of saying everyone belongs in school. And then what happens after that is how that is enacted within a country. And so we have the next concept here, the next term, inclusive practice. And inclusive practice is the things that people do to make meaning of the concept of inclusive education. All right, that's the actions, that the activities that practitioners engage in. Inclusive pedagogy is a very specific way of working. And I want to differentiate inclusive pedagogy from inclusive practice because inclusive practice, in my mind, refers to the positive and the negative. We see lots of things where we might go into a school and someone says, well, I'm struggling with inclusion. Or a teacher says, I tried inclusion and it's not working in my school. They're engaging in practices, but they're having negative experiences. And inclusive pedagogy is differentiated from the broader inclusive practice, which includes positive and negative, and says that we are talking about a way of working that refers to the acts and discourse meaning the way that we talk about children, the curriculum and learning. And it's about what teachers know and do and believe in support of the quality education and the achievement and learning of all children. You sometimes or may have seen this in some of the work that we do, where people talk about the head, the hand, and the heart. The apprentices, those are the apprentices of teaching, and they work together. What we know and do and believe about learning is at the heart of how we understand pedagogical practice. So if we move to the next slide, please, what I want to tell you is that my understanding as a researcher of inclusive pedagogy is what has come out of the research that myself and my colleagues, Christine Black-Hawkins and Martin Rouse, have done over many years, where we have studied the what we call teachers' craft knowledge. So if we have a situation where there are positive and negative experiences within the same system, then we know a couple of things. We know that this is difficult. We also know that it's possible because you will hear and see people say, oh, at that school, they're doing very well, or that teacher really understands this. And so we started to ask ourselves, what could we learn from the practices of these teachers who seem to be able to do very well, even though they're working in the same complex situation with the same challenges that other teachers who are saying it's not working are we're all in the same situation. So what are those teachers who are doing well doing, and how can we learn from them? And then how can we use that learning to help other teachers develop their practice? That's what inclusive pedagogy is all about. And so the how of inclusive pedagogy is our answer to that question. And if we move to the next slide, I can tell you this is what we have learned from those teachers, that there are three aspects to inclusive pedagogy that we think encapsulates and distills the approach and the way of working that the teachers in our studies have developed. And the first is that they have an understanding of differences between learners as something that's ordinary and to be expected. They do not think about children with special educational needs as different from other children. Now, they understand that each and every child is different from another, that we are all unique individuals and human beings, and no two people are the same. And there are many different types of differences, but we don't need to understand children as most children and then some children. They think of everyone and knowing that there will be differences and that they are to be expected. That's very fundamental and important to an inclusive pedagogical approach. The second is that they see themselves and they believe in themselves as capable of teaching all learners. And this is so important because often what happens is teachers get the message that they're not qualified. They're told they're not qualified. They haven't taken the specialist courses. They may not have a qualification that's required within a national education context. They feel that if a child has perhaps an impairment or does not speak the mother tongue, if there are issues around learning and difficulties in learning for particular children, that it's outside of their expertise and that someone else should be doing this work. And what we're arguing is that classroom teachers are capable of teaching all learners. And when we think about it, they've got classes with many, many children, and we're already accepting and understanding that each and every child is different from the other. And so our argument is that teachers are already differentiating between learners and thinking about how children learn and in what ways some children learn better than others, etc. And so having been identified with, for example, a special educational need, does not mean that you're not qualified to teach that child. Classroom teachers are qualified to teach all children, but, and this is also very important, they may need support. It's not right. No one can know everything about everyone all the time. And there are times when teachers need to take advice. They need to have the input and support of a specialist who can help them with particular kinds of learning difficulties where we do understand that there are additional supports that have to be put in place to ensure effective learning for some children. The question then becomes, do we need to do that in a specialist environment, or can we do that in a mainstream classroom or school in ways that that are supportive of the learning of everyone? And so what becomes essential, and this is the third element of inclusive pedagogy, is that we have to assume that we will be working collaboratively with others. No one can work alone or in isolation. We need to be drawing on the expertise and the ideas and the knowledge of other people within our schools or within the support services that are available to us. So this is what encapsulates, very, very briefly, inclusive pedagogy. And in our papers, in our books, there's much more detail. And I do have some references for you that we'll put at the end of the presentation. But this is the how of our practice. I'm sorry, go to the next slide, please. This next slide I included because I wanted to unpack a little bit this idea of difference is ordinary. And this slide just represents a one way of thinking about that. Schools are structured in ways that say we have most children and some children. So, that what that does is focuses our attention on one aspect of a child's identity. So in the example I want to use today, that would be special educational needs, or in this slide with the Venn diagram, it's disability. And so if we only think about people as disabled or not disabled, that's a binary distinction, and that leads us to most children are not disabled and some children are, and then we start thinking differently about how to organize provision of them. But if we think about each and every person as being a mix of social, biographical, and biometric attributes, then we can easily understand how all of us are the same and yet different because of the multiplicity of variables that interact in ways that make us so. And while all of us can, identify how we might, see ourselves in terms of our biometric, what we look like, and our DNA and our fingerprints are all different from each other. But then there are also other things about our family background, or our whether we're boys or girls, what our nationality is, etc. And those are the things that make us unique individuals. So that's a good way to think about difference as ordinary, and it leads us very natural into this way of thinking about accepting that we're going to have differences among the learners within our classrooms. So if we move on to the next slide, we can say that the work of inclusion for those who work in schools is what I would argue about extending what is ordinarily available to most children as opposed to doing something additional and different for some children. What this does is it turns our concept of special educational needs upside down. Because when we think about special needs as a unitary single identity marker for a student, we say, what is the additional thing that that particular child needs? And that is what sets us up to think of difference as something specific for individual children instead of an attribute of everyone. But if we think, what are we doing in this classroom for everyone? And how can we make sure that everyone is included and everyone has an opportunity to participate? Then we're extending what's ordinarily available, and we are working in an inclusive pedagogical way. And the challenge for us is to avoid the repetition of exclusion. If we go to the next slide, I'll explain very briefly what that means. The repetition of exclusion is when we differentiate an activity or the work within a classroom to such an extent that the child's present in the classroom, but what they're doing is so far removed from what everyone else is doing that they might as well not be there. They're not participating, they're not learning collaboratively with other children. And we see this a lot where we go into a classroom and a particular child may be sitting off by themselves working with a learning support assistant or a volunteer or someone who's helping them. And the curriculum that they're working on and the learning tasks they're doing are just completely different from what everyone else is doing. That is the repetition of exclusion within the classroom. That's an example in my mind of a not so great practice where inclusion is only happening in name only. It's not really happening in practice. So what teachers have to do is ask themselves when they're planning, and how do I avoid the repetition of exclusion? Am I sure that everyone has an opportunity to learn and participate with other learners? That's the heart of this. And that's where I'm going to, if we go to the next slide, I'm going to end my presentation, is that it's challenging work, and that what we're doing with inclusion is thinking about how we do the work, not what we're doing, how we do it. That's the key to this. And when we do this well, we do not hold back the progress of other learners. Now, my alarm has just gone off, so I know my 15 minutes is up, and I know we'll have questions in a few minutes, so I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Lani Florian. That's really an inspiring talk that you gave us, and it's an eye-opener for all of us. And you have also touched on the differences of the inclusive education, inclusive practice, and inclusive pedagogy. And one interesting note that you have shared with us that classroom teachers are capable of teaching all learners. Well, we have questions for you, Prof, but we will keep those questions at the end of this webinar. Right, now we will go to our next presenter, Dr. Liza Isyqi. Dr. Liza Isyqi is presently a senior lecturer at the Department of Educational Studies, IPG-KIK. She specializes in educational psychology, pedagogy, and childhood and early childhood education. She is best known for her work in child psychology and presently heading a preschool under the care of the Department of Educational Studies, especially after obtaining her PhD in inclusive education from the University of Leeds, United Kingdom. Dr. Liza's research interests include psychology and education, inclusive education, and inclusive pedagogy. She is also actively involved in developing course curricula for the Bachelor of Education degree program and postgraduate diploma program. Her present work focuses on voices of teachers pertaining to inclusive education and inclusive pedagogy. The floor is all yours, Dr. Liza.
Okay, okay, thank you very much, Dr. Venil. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good evening, everybody here in Malaysia, and also a very good morning to our audience outside Malaysia, especially in the UK. Welcome to our webinar. First of all, I would like to say thank you to all of you for being here, and also to Prof. Lani for being here as well, to share your expertise in inclusive pedagogy. All right. So my presentation today is about inclusive pedagogy using the Malaysian context. Before I continue with my presentation, I would like to leave you all with these 3 questions that we're going to explore in this talk. The first question is, what is inclusive pedagogy in Malaysian context? And the second question is, why do we need to utilize inclusive pedagogy in our teaching? And the last question is, how do we include the excluded children or students in the classroom? So in answering these questions, I will explain the conceptual framework of inclusive pedagogy in the Malaysian context. And I will conclude about what I think of the capacity of inclusive pedagogical approaches. Right? Next. All right. So before we go further, we have to look at the background first. So as stipulated in the Malaysian Education Blueprint 2013-2025, it has outlined that embracing the existence of students with specific needs. So what do we mean by specific needs here? It means not only students with special educational needs, but it also includes Bumiputras, indigenous minority, the Penan group, as well as gifted children, and also students from less enrollment school, or SKM, we call it as Sekolah Kurang Murid, as well as children who are underprivileged and also undocumented children. Okay, next. All right, so therefore, we need to have an inclusive pedagogy that to be applied in our teaching, so that we have to ensure that students will not be neglected in the mainstream of the national education. And of course, this is in line with Malaysian Education Blueprint 2013-2025, whereby it is stated that if it's not well managed and the needs are not specifically met, there would be a high possibility that they would drop out of the national education system and would not be able to develop their full potential. Okay. So next. So now based on this definition, this definition is given by a group of researchers in our department. So we conclude that inclusive pedagogy is a teaching and learning process that is specific to various abilities, skills, gender differences, weaknesses experienced by students in a classroom. But based on our understanding on inclusive pedagogy here, it means that how do we teachers make use the availability that we have in the classrooms in addressing individual differences. Okay, so that is what I meant by inclusive pedagogy. To what extent can we give opportunities and also space for students to be able to achieve certain types of tasks given for them? Thus, they need to be supported, okay, so that we can increase their engagement as well as involvement in their learning. So in this case, teachers' flexibility, equity, working collaboratively, ability to identify individual differences, and finally, embracing their differences are the principles of inclusive pedagogy that we all need to understand. Thus, here we need to ensure that students that they are not left behind or drop out. Okay, and at the same time, we need to be able to tap or develop their potentials. Okay, next. Okay, so in addressing the inclusive pedagogy, we have developed the conceptual framework of inclusive pedagogy based on our context, the Malaysian context. So as you can see in the diagram, we are based on the national curriculum, the KSSR, the KSSM, and also we also have the Malaysian Education Blueprint, and also the leadership and administration practice in schools, as well as the community, which means the professional learning community, and also the parent-teacher association, the PTA. And of course, when it comes to the teaching and learning, we have to understand the learning theories, and of course the 21st century pedagogy, and which also includes the higher order thinking skills, and also the EQ, and also the insania. And last but not least, we also include the 4 pillars in the UNESCO, which is the 4 pillars of education for the 21st century. That refers to UNESCO, which comprise of learning to know, learning to do, learning to live, and learning to be. Thus, we have identified the 4 components of inclusive pedagogy that need to be emphasized. Okay, which is the teaching and learning, teacher, assessment, and also students. Okay, so I will explain further on the 4 components. Okay, so we go to the first component here. We look at the teacher component. So if we look at the teacher component here, we can see that there are 4 elements that can be highlighted, which is the teacher's concern, the teacher's competency, caring, and also knowledgeable. So I just want to share my colleague experience about one parent who expressed her feelings about her son who are autistic, that being placed in the inclusive classroom. She shared that she wished that teachers could give her son some opportunities to hold certain positions in school, because she felt that her son's teachers did not believe in his capabilities. This is not only frustrated the mother, but also her son as well. What I am trying to say here is teachers' characters in terms of the competency, and also in the concern, and realizing students as an individual of different needs, as well as being knowledgeable in terms of skills and also experience, is very important. Okay, so teachers need to have these elements so that they can be inculcated as the teacher characters. Okay, all right. The next one is the next component will be the student component. So for this component, this is about the students. Okay, so we need to give the students a sense of autonomy, or the agency, so that they can freely choose their goals, and they can have their learning objectives, and they can also monitor their own progress. So this is something got to do with implementing self-learning, which is very important for the students nowadays. And also, we also have to talk about the students' level as well. So we look at their level as the resources, okay, and how and it can be like the aspiration for us. So we need to be able to choose appropriate teaching methods and also activities. And of course, we need to consider their learning style. And like I said just now, yes, the opportunity. So we need to give them the opportunity to explore, and also to have the deep engagement, whereby we can cultivate responsibility for learning. So for example, like project-based learning, problem-based learning, those are the elements that we can use in order to give them the opportunity. And when we talk about the social cultural here, as a multicultural country, Malaysia, we need to be able to understand the culture, be sensitive to behavior and also controversial issues that might arise. And of course, the last one is about sharing, whereby we need to encourage collaborations, like Professor just now said that we cannot work alone. So of course, we need to encourage collaboration, tolerance, and of course, communications and interactions between the teachers and the students is very important. Okay, next one is the assessment component. So as we can see in the assessment component here, we need to I think we all know that many schools rely on the norm reference assumption on students' ability. So these assumptions, sometimes we use these assumptions to make predictions about students' performance and also potential. However, we also need to look at the other way of assessing the children, not only on their academic level. So that's why we need to look at the progress of the students from continuous assessment. And also we need to focus on students' attributes, their achievements, their development, and also their participation. All right. Okay, next. And last but not least is the teaching components. So in the teaching component, this is, of course, we look at the classroom management. We also look at the teaching modules and also the pedagogical content also and the teaching resources. When we talk about the classroom management, when I said that we need to make use the availability of what we have in the classroom, it is how we manage the classroom. Okay, what kind of resources that we want to use, what kind of things that we want to organize, and what kind of assessments or evaluations that we might think is good for our students in the classroom, considering their individual differences. And of course here, the mastery of the knowledge and skills is very important. And we do have the content. I think all teachers, we have the content knowledge. But how do we transform our content knowledge into teaching? So this is something that we have to bear in mind as well. And of course, how do we diversify the resources? How do we choose the right kind of resources for our students? So here, before I go, I would like to say a few words about what I think on inclusive pedagogy. So it means that for me, inclusive pedagogy is for me, from my perspective, is like how the teacher responds to individual differences. Okay, so we need to avoid the stigma, the labeling, okay, so, because sometimes this stigma or this labeling, often we always associate it with students to be the less able kind of students. So here we need not to only focus on the teaching, but also on the social action and also the beliefs and also the knowledge and the teaching design. So as a teacher, we are the one who decide. We are the decision maker. So meaning that in making decision, particularly in pedagogical decision, is made by the teacher. And this is the result from the interaction between the knowledge, the beliefs, and also the contextual factors. So therefore, I think we need to have a kind of like a change in our pedagogical thinking from what is effective or what is successful for most students. We might have to change it to providing maximum learning opportunities for all students to engage in the classroom. So for me, that is what inclusive pedagogy is all about. Okay, so I think that's all from me. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Liza, for sharing your viewpoints and your thoughts on inclusive pedagogy. You have interestingly pointed out that inclusive pedagogy is so important that no student should be neglected in the education system by using various resources in the classroom. And you have also touched on the conceptual framework of our inclusive education, specifically on the teacher component, student assessment and teaching component. Thank you very much, Dr. Liza. However, now is the question and answer session time. So the first question we have here for Professor Lani, Professor Lani Florian. I have a question here. You have argued that combining the two means high levels of inclusion and high levels of achievement, right? You said that combining the two is not only possible, but also essential if all children are to have the opportunity to participate fully in education. Could you elaborate further on this? What do you mean by the opportunity for the students to participate fully?
I can. Thank you so much for that question. On the last slide in my presentation, which I did not show you, but it's available to you, there are some references. And one of those references is to our book, Florian, Blackhawkins, and Rouse, Achievement, Inclusion in Schools. That book, as well as the next one that was done with our colleagues in Northern Ireland and in Australia and Canada, looks at the actual ways that we can work collaboratively that produce good results for everyone. So the details of that elaborate on what I'm about to say are there in those references for you. But what we noticed in the schools that we worked in is that resources might come into a school because there are children there with additional needs. So you have additional support that comes into the school. But the way that the school deploys that support is because they're doing it in the way that adheres to the principles of inclusive pedagogy. Everyone has access to that support and everyone benefits. Now, that's a little bit tricky at the beginning because sometimes families, like in the example that Liza gave, a family might be concerned that their child isn't getting enough. But it may be that when teachers, really are working in ways that support the child for whom the resource came into the school, and they're thinking about learning as a social act that involves other people, and they let that resource be broadened to the level of the classroom, then everyone benefits from the additional resource that comes in. Now, the planning around that is very important because the teacher has to make sure that the targeted reason for the resource is central, but they don't have to just only use that resource for one child. They can use it in collaborative learning activity in a way that everyone benefits. So for me, the standard of inclusion is that all children are improving, not only the children for whom the targeted resource comes into the school. So there are many ways that language specialists, psychologists, special needs teachers can work collaboratively with mainstream teachers at the level of the whole class, keeping in mind the specific needs that were very well articulated by Liza in her presentation, keeping in mind those specific ideas, but then applying them collaboratively at the level of the classroom. And those references that I showed you really give the more specific details about how schools do that and then how teachers in classrooms, enact that practice.
Thank you, Professor. We really need good collaborators in this manner, actually. So I have another question for Dr. Liza. Dr. Liza. Right, this is the question. How can we address individual differences in a 30-minute or a 40-minute lesson in a Malaysian scenario? As you know, many young teachers, or in fact, the senior ones, the experienced ones, they face challenges in handling individual differences in the classroom. So how could they do it in a 30-minute or a 40-minute lesson in Malaysian schools? What's your advice, Dr. Liza?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. Okay, well, to answer this question, okay, we have to look at, I suppose we need to know the background of of our students, because we know that everyone is, they are very unique, and that's why they are different. Okay, so as a teacher, we need to offer choices. Choices in terms of the learning activities, in our approaches, in our strategies, as well as our techniques, in our method. So we need to be able to guide their learning within their capacity. All right. So and the second thing is we need to engage with the students, with the children, and appreciate their opinions and also their views. And then sometimes we need to read between the lines as well, meaning that sometimes they are trying to signal us something. So be sensitive. And so the third one is try not to make any kind of assumptions or passing judgment or passing remarks. Instead, we can work together with them in finding ways or options, the best way, particularly in their learning. So, for example, if we have students with special needs in our classroom, we're trying to normalize them. Instead, we capitalize their ability for their best interest. Maybe we can do it through modifications in our teaching. So we have to be flexible. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Dr. Liza. I'm sure it's doable, but we still face challenges. The challenges are always there, right, Dr. Liza? But we're
Yes.
going towards, going towards there. All right. Another question for Professor Lani Florian. How relevant inclusive pedagogy to inclusive education? This is the question, Prof. I repeat, how relevant inclusive pedagogy to inclusive education?
In my mind, inclusive pedagogy is essential to inclusive education because it's a specific approach to the enactment, to the way of teaching that is adopted within the school. And this is what helps us focus on identifying the good practice and then using that to share with our colleagues who are maybe feeling that the challenges are too much. So rather than, when teachers say to me, it's not working, I don't say to them, just make it happen. I say, where in your system, where in your school or in your community is it working better? Or are there teachers who are finding it less difficult? What can we learn from them? Can you go and talk to them? Can you work with them in their school? That's when thinking about all of this in terms of what I called the head and the hand and the heart, the knowledge, skills, and beliefs about inclusion. It may be that a teacher believes inclusion is the right thing to do, but they don't feel that they have the knowledge. So then they have to go and seek that out from colleagues who do have that knowledge and develop that. And I think in Liza's slide about the teacher component, we really see a beautiful explanation of that. You've got she has a different title for those components, but they represent the head and the hand and the heart. And then there's a fourth box in her slide that has the concern. And I think using that as a kind of framework within your system to actually think about, how do we strategically, how do we use this inclusive pedagogical approach to make sure that our idea and our implementation of the concept of inclusion that's consistent with the Sustainable Development Goal is working well within our country. I hope that gives you like a little bit of an idea about how, I differentiate between the concept of inclusion and the practice of inclusion, and then the standard of inclusion done well for everyone in terms of the inclusive education, inclusive practices, and inclusive pedagogy. But I think you've got a very firm foundation within the Malaysian context to identify where things are working well and then help people learn from each other to grow that practice so that everyone has a good experience of inclusion.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts. That's a lovely thought that you have on our education system. Thank you. And lastly, a question to Dr. Liza. How important is inclusive pedagogy among teachers in Malaysia? Could you briefly explain the importance of inclusive pedagogy among teachers in Malaysia?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, to answer these questions, I think we have to look at the four components of the inclusive pedagogy that I already presented. So those four components can be utilized. So not only focusing on the teaching strategy, but we also need to look at the other components, which is the teacher component, assessment component, and also the student component. So as mentioned earlier, when we talk about the teacher, okay, we are looking at the teacher's concern, the caring, competency, and knowledge. So in the school context, teacher need to be teacher who are concerned on their students will take action. Okay, they will take action in order to cater the needs of the students, and they will focus on their the students' development in terms of cognitive, emotion, physical, and also spiritual. Thus, when teachers are available, okay, they will be willing to listen and try to create a good and healthy relationship with the student. So, developing mutual trust and also respect to teachers and students will influence teachers' pedagogical choices. So here we can see that the teacher can see the effectiveness of certain methods or certain techniques, or maybe we call it as best practices, and maybe they can improve the students' learning, and of course, perhaps they can share it with other teachers as well. So, like Prof. Lani said, sometimes it may not work working on this teacher or that particular classroom, but it may work in other situation or in other context. But the thing is, we need to collaborate and also we need to share the best practices. Yeah, it may not work, it may, but yeah, why not?
Yeah, thank you so much for your thoughts. And I think we are slowly getting there, yeah, Dr. Liza, right? Of course, I think our country is gearing towards the inclusive education as well as inclusive pedagogy, right?
Yeah.
We would like to go on further, but really time is not on our side. Probably, what are your last words, Professor? Your thoughts on inclusive pedagogy before we
I would say that I really meant what I said about, I think you have a lot of components for a framework for action and a good foundation for building practice, and to be positive, to to really focus on where are things working well and learning from each other. I think that is the key strategy within any country. And I'm very honored that you invited me to come and speak with you today and to share my work. But I know my research comes from, a different context. I believe in the principles, and I think I have had enough international experience to know that they apply more broadly. But I also think that only people within the national context can really make the difference. And that, the collaboration at the international level for sharing ideas is really important, but the growing the practice and embedding it and making it just become part of schooling within your country is the work for the colleagues in Malaysia to do. But having said that, I see that you have a lot of, you have such a firm foundation. So I wish you all the best.
Thank you so much,
Thank you for
Professor
inviting me.
Lani. And your final thoughts, Dr. Liza, any words of advice that you would like to give?
From my part, okay, for me, when we talk about inclusive pedagogy, we are not expecting kind of like a rocket science kind of, what kind of pedagogy that we have to use, so we have to have a rocket science here. But it is something that this is something a very foundation for us as a teacher. Okay, so to be able to see individual differences, to look at the individual differences and to work around that individual differences. I think that is the key point here. And how are we going to help students, the learning of the students? So this is something that we need to bear in mind as a teacher. It's not just like finishing the syllabus and then do the assessment and finish. So it's more than that, it's beyond that, okay, because we are talking about human being here. Okay, so we want to develop their potential and push their potential to their maximum or optimum level. So I guess this is something that, I mean, everybody needs to have this kind of understanding. What is inclusive pedagogy all about? Is that all? Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Liza. So we would like to go on further, but I'm afraid that we have come to the end of this webinar. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. And thank you once again to Professor Lani Florian and to Dr. Liza Isyqi for taking time to participate in this webinar. And thank you viewers for attending this session. So if you have any additional questions for the presenters, please ask them through emails and you can Google them up. So have a good day, everyone. Till we meet again. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.